Hey guys. Okay, so next, what we're going to do is we're essentially going to move into a stage where we ask ourselves a few fundamental questions. The purpose of this is essentially to start setting the foundation of your show and coming up with your show concept. Um, Again, this structure has been borrowed from Mark Asquith. I think it's one of the best ones out there. And I think it's a really amazing one to essentially funnel the various different thoughts that currently are in your mind and bring them down to a point where you essentially have an idea about what your show is going to be about, the type of structure that it's going to take, and why you're doing it. So let's start with essentially this three-step approach on how you should be asking yourself certain questions that lead you to this specific answer. So the first question that you need to ask yourself is, what is your why? So why are you looking to start a podcast? What is driving you towards this decision? Normally, people will have one of three answers when it comes to asking themselves their why. So the first one is you're either starting it because you want to talk about something that you're very passionate about. And it's something that you want to start as a hobby because either not anybody in your vicinity or circles has as much passion as you about it, and nobody's going to be willing to listen to you for as long as you want to talk to them about a specific thing, or just because you've got a lot of knowledge in your mind on something and you believe that there's an audience out there that could benefit from this, or it could be a really interesting way to actually continue to force yourself to keep learning about a particular skill set, because once you start speaking about something, then you're accountable to an audience, so you go deeper down that rabbit hole. So the first one is you're starting it because you're passionate about something or it's a hobby of yours. The second reason is you're starting this podcast for a business purpose. So you're either starting it as a business or you're starting it for a specific business that you're already running. And you've got a very clear-cut understanding of basically the reason that is driving you towards making this podcast. It may be audience engagement. It may be building your top-of-funnel awareness. It may be branding. But essentially, a whole host of these reasons can culminate into why you're looking to start a podcast from a business perspective. And then the third one is because somebody told you to start this podcast. This may be an employer of yours. This may be somebody who you're working for on a contractual basis, but essentially you've been tasked with starting your podcast. So first ask yourself, out of these three, which bucket do you fall into? All right. So this should be fairly easy. You just have to pick one. And now that you know this, the next thing that you need to ask yourself is a few questions around the idea itself. So a lot of people struggle with what their podcast should be about. And oftentimes you see people getting stuck in the analysis paralysis zone right here itself. But it's actually rather quite easy. So what you need to do is you need to start with taking a piece of paper and just writing down a few things that you're very passionate about or you know about in great detail, more than the average Joe. So take a few of these different things and you write them down. Essentially, let's say hypothetically you're somebody that really likes music, or you really like playing the lead guitar, and you don't currently have somebody in your circle that loves to talk about it as much as you like it, or you like collecting vintage cars. You essentially write that down. So that's very easy, shouldn't be daunting. Now, the part B of this process is, on the flip side of this paper, write down what audience members on the other side, a fictional audience group, would potentially like to hear about. Oftentimes, we call this TAM in the startup ecosystem, so your total addressable market. So which one of these ideas or which one of these topics has the largest potential TAM? Or within this particular topic that you've chosen, is there a subtopic that sits within it where there is an interesting TAM that currently exists, where there's a large enough grouping of people that could be potentially excited or interested in it. And then the third thing that you need to ask is, okay, I've noted down the things that I really want to talk about. And then on the other side, I've noted down the things that people want to hear about. Now, finally, I need to write down what podcasts already exist in the world where there essentially is too much competition. And as a consequence, you'll automatically find different avenues within this same grouping of things you like to talk about and things other people like to hear about. Where are there certain blue oceans where the market is currently underserved, and you can create a podcast and on the start of your podcast itself, be ahead of the pack because you're one of the first entrants that's creating within this space. It's super easy to do actually. Go to Apple Podcasts. So once you've done step A and step B of this second section, and in Apple Podcasts, just search for podcasts that fall into that particular category that you've currently identified. So let's say that you've identified you want to talk about Game of Thrones, or you're very interested in talking about Game of Thrones, and what you realize is people like to hear about reviews when it comes to TV shows. So just you can go intuitively on Apple Podcasts and just see how many Game of Thrones related podcasts exist, and within that universe of Game of Thrones podcasts, how many people are doing reviews on Game of Thrones. And you can do this across a couple of the few things that you're essentially doing. And the avenue where you find the least competition, but a fairly still large enough TAM, and you're very excited about talking about this particular thing, this is where you have your intersection, or once again, a Goldilocks scenario that exists for yourself. And that should be essentially an idea that you should be paying very close attention to. If this is happening for one or two things, that's amazing. I mean, you shouldn't have too many here, but if you're playing against two different ideas, that's also fine at this stage. And now finally, you know why you're starting your podcast. That's what we asked in the first question. And the second question is essentially a little bit about what you want your podcast to be about. So the idea, and that further breaks down into what you like talking about, audiences like to listen to, and what competition currently exists in the market. So you are funneling down and you have a broad idea of what you can potentially be speaking about, where you already are ahead of the pack. And now the final piece of this puzzle is essentially what structure is this show going to take? So is this structure going to be a format of your show going to be a solo show? Is it going to be a co-hosted show? Is it going to be an interview-based show? Or is it going to be one of those large conversational podcasts which have a bunch of different people that are speaking at the same time? An interesting trick to actually answering this question is ask yourself what your final end goal with your podcast is. And that will actually lead you to the optimum format that you should be choosing. So, for example, there are normally three main things that people like to start their podcast for. People like to start their podcast with the overall goal of increasing their own brand equity or building a network. So they want to establish their business as a brand that's well known by a lot of people, or themselves as a brand. Another thing is that maybe that's not their overall goal. Their end goal is actually to sell specific things, whether that's on a personal capacity or that may be at a company capacity. So that's why you see a lot of D2C companies with podcasts themselves. So maybe your end goal with your podcast is to have basically conversion rates to people buying your end product whilst finding out about your brand. Or as an individual yourself, you may be essentially selling a service like webinars, or you may be selling certain micro SaaS solutions, whatever that may be. If your goal is for people to buy things directly from you, that can be a second another goal. And then the third goal is that you just want to monetize the podcast itself, where the entity of the podcast is essentially what you're trying to develop till a point in which it's either acquired, or you can get payments directly from your listeners, or you can get payments from brands. So normally when you have a podcast, you have one out of these three goals. And interestingly enough, if you know what your goal is, then the format that you should choose can become fairly intuitive. And I'll explain how. So let's take, for example, that your end goal is currently to increase your network, or to increase awareness about you, your brand, whatever it may be. In this case, the format that you should be picking is an interview format. And there's a very obvious reasoning into why you should be picking an interview format. It's because of the network effects that you can leverage off of from bringing on people onto your show who already have very large networks. So essentially, by creating a show where you have large marquee individuals coming to your show on a weekly capacity, there are two things that are happening here. One, you're building your own brand authority by association. And the second thing that you're doing is you're going to be able to leverage off of their current networks. And as a consequence of that, you will be well on your way into building a larger network very, very quickly for yourself. Howsoever, if your goal is not to build a network, but rather to sell something, and let's say that this is to sell something as an individual or as a brand itself, as a D2C brand, in this scenario, an interview may not be your best option. In this scenario, the format that you should potentially be considering is solo show, if you're confident enough to create a solo show at this point in time, or on a show that's co-hosted with somebody. If you run a startup, this could be with your founder, co-founder. If you are creating the show as an individual, it could be one of your really close friends that shares a specific passion with you. And the main reasoning for this is twofold. One is essentially because in this scenario, the limelight and the focus continues to remain entirely with you. You are showcasing your depth of knowledge and your prowess in a particular field and a particular subject, rather than shedding light on the expertise of somebody else that you're bringing onto the show. And as a consequence of this, you're also completely able to maintain the show flow and the show structure towards a particular call to action. And in this scenario, your call to action may be for people to buy a particular good or a particular service. So everything around the show can be structured around getting people to that end call to action, which is why in this scenario, you should be opting for a solo show in which you're able to create a large amount of depth of knowledge in the eyes of your audience or in the ears of your audience, and you're able to drive the show in a structure that works poetically towards a call to action that works best for you. And then in the third scenario, where you're looking to create essentially a property or a show where the show itself is what will be monetized. It's not some service or a product that you're trying to drive people towards. In this scenario as well, ideal state is that you should not be getting on, you should not have an interview-based show. You should be focusing on a solo show or a co-hosted show, much for the same reasons as the points above. And the main objective for you over here is to create something that is deeply engaging, that is not shallow in its waters in terms of how deeply you go into a particular topic. You should be leaving that particular, you should have your listeners leaving that particular episode or any show that you take out, whether in a live capacity or an online capacity. They should be walking away feeling as though you know about this specific thing better than anybody else. And as a consequence, they all automatically start to build brand authority within you. They start to have faith within your skill sets and your domain expertise. And as a consequence, your show in itself starts to become a property that people start to follow week on week on week because they want to hear more from you, as opposed to hearing from somebody else that may be a guest that's jumping from one show to another show. And over time, what should happen over here is, if you have one show that starts to become very successful, you could try a few different monetization methodologies for that show itself. Don't be too spammy in this nature. And you don't know which one will strike essentially this the match of making the show essentially a self-sustaining show and a profitable show. But over time, if you keep trying your hand at this, you will be well on your way to having a show that is a property that actually monetizes for itself. So if you follow this structure, what you should at the end of it end up with is a why. So why are you looking to start this show to begin with? Is it a passion? Is it for a particular business purpose? Or is it because somebody's told you? You should be able to navigate around the idea of the show, where we essentially walk through a specific set of structures where you write down things that you like talking about. You also write down what people may like listening to, and then you see where you may have a competitive advantage because there's currently a dearth of podcasts or shows in a field that you previously identified. And then finally, when it comes to choosing the format, your format can be very linked to the goal of your show. So once you've identified the end goal of your show, whether that's to build your own brand equity and network, or whether that's to monetize something outside of your show, your own product or your own services, or whether that's to monetize the show as a property itself, this should lead you towards the type of format that you should be picking. So I hope at the end of this, you're already feeling a lot more confident, because you should have a bunch of questions answered, which you previous to this may not have had answered. So I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And apologies, this has been a slightly longer one. We'll keep it more brief from next time down. Okay, thanks so much.